You are lying in a quiet room. The night has settled fully now, the way it does when the last sounds of the day have finally passed, and there is nothing left between you and the dark. This is the hour that belongs to no one. The hour between the end of one day and the beginning of the next, when the ordinary claims on your attention have loosened their grip and the mind is free to wander somewhere it would not usually go. Tonight we are going to a painting that was made for the dark. Not for the dark in the way that sleep is for the dark, or rest, or the quiet relief of a day ending. Made for the dark in the way that certain truths are for the dark, the ones that are too large or too complicated or too honest to be looked at in full daylight, when the ordinary world is pressing in from all sides and asking things of you. It is a painting about violence, about a woman doing something brutal and necessary and right in the middle of the night, in a room not unlike the one you are lying in now. And you might wonder, as perhaps you should, whether this is the right painting for this hour. Whether there is something strange about bringing a beheading into the last quiet moments before sleep. But the night has always been the right place for this painting. It was made in the dark. It depicts the dark. Its subject is what people are capable of when no one is watching, when the world has gone to sleep, and the only witness is a maid with a cloth bag and a God who has been asked, very specifically, for the strength to continue. And there is something about the end of the day, about the mind in this particular state, loosened from its obligations, drifting, that allows a painting like this to reach you differently than it would at any other hour. In the dark, with nothing required of you, difficult things become bearable. Sometimes more than bearable. Sometimes the only way through them. The painting is called Judith Beheading Holofernes. It was made by Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, probably in the years 1598 and 1599, when he was in his late 20s and Rome was his city and everything was still possible. It is large enough, if you stood before it, to feel as though you might step through the frame and into the scene itself. It lives now in the Palazzo Barberini in Rome, in a room with stone floors and high ceilings, and people walk past it every day, sometimes pausing, sometimes not. Tonight we are going to do what those hurrying visitors rarely do. We are going to stay. Let us begin with the darkness. Before anything else, before the figures, before the action, before the blood and the sword and the three faces caught in the light, there is the darkness. Caravaggio's background in this painting is not merely dark. It is absolute. A blackness that does not read as an empty wall or an unlit room, but as something closer to the absence of everything that is not this moment. He has stripped the world away. There is no architecture, no landscape, no suggestion of the wider world beyond this chamber, this night, this act. Everything that is not essential has been given to the dark, and the dark has kept it. This was a choice, and it was a radical one. Painters before Caravaggio, and many after him, filled their backgrounds with things, columns, curtains, distant landscapes, architectural details that located the scene in time and place and gave the eye somewhere to rest between the important things. Caravaggio refused all of that. He understood that darkness is not an absence, but a presence, and that a figure emerging from true darkness carries a weight and an immediacy that no decorated background can produce. When you let yourself imagine the painting now, in the dark of your own room, the blackness behind the three figures feels almost physical. It presses forward. It makes the lit faces and bodies seem not just visible, but urgent, as though the light that holds them is temporary, and the dark is patient and will eventually reclaim everything. Which, of course, it will. Which, of course, it does. Now the light. A single source entering from the left side of the painting. In the great tradition of European painting before Caravaggio, light was understood primarily as a tool for visibility. You lit your figures so that the viewer could see them clearly, appreciate their forms, follow their gestures, read their expressions. Light was in service of legibility. It came from everywhere and nowhere in particular, gentle and diffuse, a kind of luminous atmosphere rather than a directed force. Caravaggio changed what light was for. In Judith Beheading Holofernes, the light is not diffuse. It is narrow, concentrated. It enters from a specific point and falls on specific things and leaves everything else in darkness. It functions less like sunlight and more like a lantern held very close to a scene in an otherwise unlit room. Or like a judgment, illuminating exactly what needs to be seen and insisting that the rest not distract you. This light strikes Judith first. Her pale gown catches it and holds it, cream or silver white, luminous against the dark, and from there it moves to her face, to her hands, to the blade of the sword, to the contorted upper body of the man she is killing. It finds Abra, the maid, at the right edge of the canvas, picking out the lines of her old face with remarkable fidelity. And then the light runs out, and the dark resumes, and that is all there is. The effect is that the eye has no choice. There is nowhere else to look. The darkness has removed every alternative, and the light has arranged what remains into something that feels less like a composition and more like an event. Something happening now that you have walked in on by accident and cannot look away from. Caravaggio understood something about human attention that most painters of his time did not, that we do not look at everything equally. We look at what is lit. We look at what moves. We look at faces. And if you want to make someone feel the full weight of a moment, you do not give them a panorama. You give them exactly one thing to look at, surrounded by dark, and you make it impossible to turn away. And now, at last, the figures. There are 3 of them. They are pressed close together and close to the front of the painting, pushed almost to the surface, as though they are trying to cross the line between the canvas and the room where you are standing. There is almost no depth behind them, almost no space between their bodies and the darkness. Caravaggio has compressed the scene until it is nearly airless, until the 3 figures and the act they are performing fill the frame so completely that there is nowhere for the viewer to stand outside it. You are inside this painting, whether you want to be or not. Let us begin on the left. The young woman. She stands with her weight slightly forward, her arms extended before her, both hands wrapped around the hilt of a sword. The sword is long and heavy. You can feel the weight of it even from here, and she holds it with the grip of someone who is not accustomed to holding swords, but who has decided that this particular sword will be held and used, and the matter concluded before she allows herself to think too much more about it. She is elegantly dressed. This is the first thing that strikes many viewers, and it continues to strike them even after many viewings. Her gown is pale, cream or white, with a warm undertone, and it is not simple. It has the look of fabric that cost something, fabric chosen with care and worn on an occasion that required it. Her hair is pinned up beneath a cloth that is partly gold, partly cream. She is wearing earrings. She is, in her dress and her bearing, a woman of refinement, and she is, at this exact moment, cutting off a man's head. The distance between those two things, the elegance and the act, is one of the painting's central subjects. Caravaggio will not let you resolve it. He will not dress her as a warrior, or roughen her hands, or put fury in her face to explain and justify what she is doing. She remains precisely herself, refined, careful, and finely dressed, while doing the most brutal thing the painting can contain. Her face. This is where the painting lives finally. This is where Caravaggio has concentrated everything that makes it more than a scene of violence, more than a biblical illustration, more than a demonstration of his considerable technical abilities. She is not triumphant. This needs to be said clearly because many paintings of this subject, and there are many spanning centuries, show Judith in triumph. Serene. Composed in the way that figures are composed when they know they have done what God required and they are at peace with it. Or, in other traditions, Judith is shown as fierce, as a woman fully inhabited by righteous anger, the sword an extension of her will, the act a statement rather than a sacrifice. Caravaggio's Judith is neither of these things. Her brow is furrowed very slightly. Her lips are pressed together in a line that is not quite determination and not quite revulsion, but something between the two, something that has no simple name, that you recognize not from other paintings but from life. From the face of someone doing something that must be done, that they have decided to do, that they know is right, and that costs them, visibly, something they will not get back. Her eyes are directed at the work before her with a focus that is almost clinical. She is not looking away. She is not closing her eyes or turning her face or retreating into herself to get through the moment. She is looking with full attention at what her hands are doing. She is present for this. She has decided to be present for this because to look away would be a different kind of cowardice, and she will not allow herself that. And then, and this is the detail that has preoccupied scholars and viewers, and anyone who has spent real time with this painting, her body tells a different story than her hands. Her arms extend forward toward Holofernes, toward the act. But her torso, her shoulders, the line of her body, these lean fractionally, subtly, almost imperceptibly away. Not far. Not in retreat. But enough that the eye registers a split between the woman who has decided to do this thing and the woman who cannot entirely prevent her body from recoiling from the doing of it. It is a small thing. A very small thing. And it is everything. Because what Caravaggio has painted is not the simple execution of a decision, He has painted the fact that courage is not the absence of reluctance. It is reluctance overcome, moment by will. Judith's hands continue because her mind has decided they will continue. But her body has not been fully convinced, and it shows. And Caravaggio has seen it and painted it, and here it is 400 years later, still visible, still true. Now the center. Now Holofernes. He is, by any measure, a magnificent figure, even here, even in this extremity. Caravaggio does not diminish him. He does not reduce Holofernes to a symbol of evil overcome, or a mere body on a bed, or an occasion for Judith's heroism. He gives him the full weight of a human being in the last moments of his life, and that weight is considerable. Holofernes twists upward from the bed, not the still unconscious body of a man who does not know what is happening, but the convulsing, violent, desperate twist of a body that knows, in the way bodies know before minds do, that something catastrophic is occurring. His upper body rises from the sheets in a spasm. His eyes are open, wide open, the whites visible, the gaze unfocused or focused on something that is not in this room. His mouth is open. Not in a cry. There is no time for a cry, or the cry has passed, but in the involuntary openness of a body that has stopped performing composure and is simply responding, without art, to what is happening to it. One hand grips the white sheet beneath him. You can see the force of the grip, the fingers pressing into the fabric, finding purchase on the only solid thing available. The other arm is thrown outward and slightly upward in a gesture that reads, across the centuries, as reaching for something, for someone, for the continuation of a life that is already ending. This hand, this extended, reaching hand, it is one of the most arresting details in the painting, because it is so utterly human. Holofernes is, in the story, a conqueror, a general, a man of enormous worldly power. He has spent his life taking things, territories, cities, the submission of other people. And here, at the end, his hand reaches out not to take but to hold on. To not be taken. To remain. It does not work. It cannot work. We know this, and the painting knows this, and somewhere in the failing light of his wide-open eyes, Holofernes is beginning to know this too. Caravaggio's rendering of the body here is almost forensic. The musculature of the chest and neck, the texture of the skin, the specific way in which the body responds to this kind of violence, these are observed with a precision that suggests Caravaggio had looked very closely at bodies under extreme duress. Whatever the source of that knowledge, the result is a body that does not feel painted. It feels recorded. And the blood. Caravaggio does not spare us the blood, and this too was a choice that shocked his contemporaries and continues to hold power today. The blood moves across the scene in jets that have been noted by physicians and anatomists who have studied the painting as physiologically accurate. This is how blood behaves when a major vessel is severed. It is not decorative. It is not symbolic in the way that blood in earlier religious painting is often symbolic, a contained formal red that stands for sacrifice, rather than depicting it. This blood is actual. This is what the body contains, and this is what happens when it is no longer contained. For some viewers across the centuries, this has been too much. Too literal. too unwilling to soften the reality of what the painting depicts. But Caravaggio was making an argument with that blood, and the argument is this: if you are going to tell this story, tell it honestly. If you are going to show what liberation costs, show what liberation costs. Do not make it beautiful in a way that lets the viewer off the hook. Make them stay with it. Make them understand. And now the right edge of the canvas. Almost at the border between the lit scene and the dark, as though she has positioned herself to be half in and half out of this moment, stands the figure who has, in many ways, been underappreciated in discussions of this painting for centuries. Judith's maid. She is old. The oldest person in the painting by several decades, and Caravaggio has not smoothed the years from her face. Every line is there, the deep lines around the eyes, the loosened skin of the jaw, the particular quality of a face that has lived through a great many things and is no longer surprised by any of them. Her hair is covered by a cloth. Her clothing is plain, without ornament, practical. She is a working woman, and she looks like one. She leans slightly forward. Her hands are open before her, and most scholars read in her posture the sense of a woman holding a bag, or ready to hold a bag, for what is about to be placed inside it. The cloth bag that appears in the biblical account, the bag in which Judith and Abra will carry the head of Holofernes back through the enemy camp and into the sleeping town of Bethulia before dawn. Her face is the third great psychological portrait in the painting. She is not horrified. This is the first thing to note, because horror might be the expected response, the response of someone encountering violence for the first time, or someone who has not fully understood what they agreed to when they came on this expedition. Abra's face is not the face of someone encountering violence for the first time. She is watchful, alert. Her eyes are on the scene before her with a focused attention that reads as competence rather than distress. She has, you feel, been in difficult situations before. She has stood at the edge of hard things and done what was needed without the luxury of falling apart. She is doing that now. There is in her face something that might be called grim encouragement. The expression of someone who knows that the person beside them has nearly completed a very difficult task and who is holding steady so that they can do the same. Abra does not look away. Abra has decided not to look away, just as Judith has decided not to look away. And in this, in the quality of their shared attention, their shared willingness to be present for the full reality of this moment, they are together in a way that is almost tender. The contrast between Abra and Judith is one of the painting's richest structures. Youth and age, hesitation and steadiness, fine dress and plain dress, the woman who recoils even while acting, and the woman who has recoiled so many times in her long life that she has learned to hold the recoil inside where it doesn't interfere with what needs to be done. They are not the same person. They are not at the same stage of a life. But they are here together in the dark, doing this together, and that togetherness, quiet and unspoken, is the human heart of the painting. Step back now in your mind's eye. Take in the whole composition at once. 3 figures, pressed close. Almost no space between them and the picture plane, as though they are being pushed toward you rather than receding away. the darkness absolute behind them, the light concentrated, deliberate, unforgiving. And behind the group, a length of red drapery, the one decorative element Caravaggio allows himself, hanging in soft folds like the curtain of a stage. As though this were a theater, and we the audience, and the scene before us one that has been performing for more than 400 years to anyone willing to sit still long enough to watch it. The red drapery. Let us stay with it for a moment. It is the warmest color in the painting, in a painting that is otherwise cool, the whites and creams and pale flesh tones, and the cold gleam of metal. The red softens nothing about the scene. It does not make the violence less shocking or the figures less exposed. But it does something important to the composition. It creates a boundary, a background that is not quite darkness and not quite light, a zone of warmth behind a scene of coldness, and it anchors the eye, gives it a resting place between the figures. In the tradition of Italian painting, red drapery often signifies something. Also, ceremony, the sacred. Whether Caravaggio intends all of these associations here, or whether he has simply made a choice of extraordinary compositional intelligence, the effect is the same. The red says, this matters. What is happening here matters. It is not casual. It is not small. There's one more thing to say about the painting itself before we move into the story that lies behind it, and the man who made it, and all the centuries through which it has traveled to reach us here tonight. The painting is not about the moment before or the moment after. This sounds simple, but it is not. The depiction of a narrative moment in painting almost always involves a choice about where in time to place the image. And most painters, when given this choice with this story, chose the aftermath. Judith holding the head. Judith and Abra leaving the camp. Judith presenting her victory to the people of Bethulia. The decisive moment rendered as its triumphant conclusion, so that the violence is implied rather than shown, present in the object held rather than in the act itself. Caravaggio chose the act. Not the preparation, not the aftermath. The unstable, irreversible, in-between instant when intention becomes action, and action becomes consequence, and there is no longer any possibility of going back. The sword is in motion. The blood is moving. Holofernes is still alive, barely for one more second, and Judith is still deciding moment by moment to continue. That choice to paint the during rather than the before or after is what gives the painting its unbearable immediacy. It is why standing before it in Palazzo Barberini, even today, even knowing the story and the artist and the art history, still stops people. Still makes them go quiet. Still makes the well-traveled, the sophisticated, the visitors who have been to hundreds of galleries and are not easily shaken, still makes them slow down and look longer than they plan to look at a moment that is more than 400 years old and feels like it is happening now. To understand why this painting exists, why it looks the way it looks, why it carries the weight it carries, you need to know two things. You need to know the story, and you need to know the man. We will take them in turn, and we will take our time with both. The story first. The Book of Judith is one of the oldest stories in the world about a woman who saves her people by refusing to accept that salvation is impossible. It is a book of the Bible, included in the Catholic and Orthodox canons, present in the ancient Greek Septuagint, though absent from the Hebrew Bible and from most Protestant traditions, which regard it as apocryphal. This is a detail worth knowing because it tells you something about the story's status. It has always occupied an uncertain position, authoritative enough to be read, strange enough to be questioned, compelling enough to survive every attempt to set it aside. The setting is the ancient Near East, at a time of empire and siege and the particular terror of small nations watching large ones move across the landscape toward them. Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians, has sent his general Holofernes westward at the head of an enormous army. The campaign has been devastatingly successful. City after city has fallen, or surrendered, or been absorbed. Holofernes is a man accustomed to getting what he wants, because what he wants he takes, and what he cannot take he destroys, and there is very little in this part of the world that has been able to offer him meaningful resistance. Now his army surrounds a small Jewish town in the hill country. The town is called Bethulia, and it controls a mountain pass that Holofernes needs. His strategy is not direct assault, but siege. Cut off the water supply. Wait. Let thirst and desperation do what armies sometimes cannot. It is a patient strategy, and it is working. Inside the walls of Bethulia, 34 days into the siege, the situation is dire. The cisterns are nearly empty. The people are weakening. Children are collapsing in the streets. The elders of the town have gathered to discuss what must be done, and the answer they have arrived at, with great reluctance, with grief, is surrender. 5 more days, they say. If God has not delivered us in 5 more days, we will open the gates. It is at this moment that Judith appears. We have not met her yet in the story, and her introduction is deliberately striking. She is a widow. Her husband Manasseh died 3 years earlier of heat stroke during the barley harvest, and she has been in mourning since, wearing sackcloth, fasting, living quietly in a tent on the roof of her house with her maid Abra. She is wealthy. Her husband left her land, servants, cattle, gold and silver, and she has managed his estate with care and intelligence. She is pious. She is beautiful. And she has been, until now, apart from the world and its crises, attending to her grief and her prayers. She summons the elders to her, and she rebukes them. Not unkindly, but clearly and without apology. She tells them that to set a deadline for God is itself a kind of faithlessness. That despair is a form of pride, the pride of thinking you understand the limits of what is possible. She does not tell them what she intends to do. She tells them only to open the gate for her that night and to pray. What follows is one of the most deliberate and psychologically complex preparations in ancient literature. Judith goes back to her house. She removes her widow's clothes, the sackcloth, the garments of mourning she has worn for 3 years. She washes. She anoints herself with precious ointment. She dresses her hair. She puts on the finest clothes she wore in the days of her husband's life. She adds sandals, anklets, bracelets, rings. She puts on earrings and all her other jewelry. She makes herself as beautiful as she is capable of being, and the text is unambiguous that this is a weapon, not a vanity. She is arming herself. She is putting on the armor that her situation requires. Abra carries a bag of food, kosher food, food that Judith can eat in an enemy camp without violating her religious laws. Wine and oil, parched grain and fig cakes and bread. And they walk out of Bethulia together, through the gate, down into the valley, and straight toward the Assyrian sentries. The sentries stop them. Judith is calm. She tells them she is a Hebrew woman, fleeing from her people because she knows that Holofernes will be victorious, and she wants to show the general a way to take the hill country without losing a single man. The sentries look at her. The text says that her beauty astonished them. They take her immediately to their commander. She passes through the camp. 100 men accompany her, the text says, because the commotion of her arrival has drawn a crowd, and the crowd gathers not for military reasons, but because of how she looks, because of the simple, ancient, irresistible power of a beautiful woman walking through a place where men have been at war for months, with nothing to look at but each other and the distant walls of a town they cannot take. Holofernes receives her in his tent. He is lying on his bed beneath a canopy of purple and gold and emeralds and precious stones, a canopy designed to impress, to overwhelm, to make clear from the first moment that you are in the presence of a man before whom other men have trembled. Judith prostrates herself before him. And then she lifts her face and speaks, and everything she says is true and false at the same time, a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. She tells him that her people have sinned against their God, and that God is about to punish them, that she has received a prophecy that he will succeed, that she wants to lead him to victory. Every word of this is constructed to be believed, and none of it means what he thinks it means. Holofernes is enchanted, not only by her beauty, though the text makes clear that this is considerable, but by her intelligence, her composure, her apparent willingness to betray her own people. He tells his servants that God has done well to send such a woman ahead of her people, that she will be rewarded. He invites her to eat with him. She declines politely, explaining that she has her own food for religious reasons. He finds this charming. For 4 days, Judith is in the camp. Each night she goes out to pray in the valley before dawn. Her gods let her go because she has told them this is her practice, and because they have no reason to suspect that a beautiful woman who has voluntarily walked into their camp has any intention of walking out of it again with anything other than Assyrian protection. And each morning she returns and eats her own food and waits. On the 4th day, Holofernes speaks to his steward Bagoas. He says it would be a disgrace to let such a woman go without enjoying her company. Bagoas goes to Judith and delivers the invitation to a private banquet in the general's tent that evening. She accepts. She dresses again in all her finery. The banquet is held. Holofernes drinks more wine that evening than he had drunk on any single day since he was born. And when the evening ends and the servants withdraw and Abra waits outside and the great tent is quiet, Holofernes falls across his bed in a stupor. Judith stands beside him for a moment. Then she prays. The prayer is recorded in the text, and it is not a long prayer, but it is a precise one. She asks God to strengthen her hand. That is almost all she asks. Not for forgiveness, not for reassurance, not for a sign. Just for the strength in her hand to do what needs to be done. She takes his sword from the post beside the bed. She takes him by the hair of his head. And she strikes him twice on the neck with all her strength and takes off his head. She gives it to Abra. Abra puts it in the food bag. They walk out of the camp together, as they have done every night, going out to pray. The gods let them pass. They walk up the mountain road in the dark. And before dawn, they are back inside the walls of Bethulia, and Judith is standing before the people of her town, holding up the head of Holofernes, and everything has changed. The story does not end there, but this is where the paintings end, and it is where we end too. Because what follows, the routing of the Assyrian army, the celebration of Bethulia, the hymn of thanksgiving, is epilogue. The story is over the moment Judith walks back through the gate. Everything after is consequence. What remains at the center of the story is that tent, that dark, that sword. Those two women standing over a sleeping man, one of them asking for the strength she needs and then finding it, and the other holding a bag open and waiting without flinching for what comes next. Now the man. Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio was born in 1571, most likely in Milan, though the town of Caravaggio in Lombardy, from which he took his name, was where his family had roots and where he may have spent part of his childhood. The details of his early life are fragmentary, assembled from parish records and legal documents and the anecdotes of later biographers, some of whom knew him and some of whom did not, and all of whom found him interesting enough to embellish. What is clear is that he trained as a painter in Milan, in the workshop of Simone Pederzano, for approximately 4 years in the 1580s. Pederzano was a competent painter who had studied under Titian and who gave his young apprentice a solid technical foundation, and, perhaps more importantly, exposure to the Lombard tradition of painting. A tradition that valued close observation of the natural world, realistic rendering of surfaces, and an attention to light that was more interested in how things actually looked than in how they ought ideally to appear. These were the lessons Caravaggio carried to Rome. He arrived in the city sometime in the early 1590s, probably around 1592 or 1593, young and largely unknown, and without the kind of powerful connections that smoothed a painter's path in late Renaissance Rome. The city he entered was one of the most extraordinary places in the world at that moment, rebuilt and reimagined over the previous century by a succession of ambitious popes, full of ancient ruins and new churches, of pilgrims and scholars and artists and adventurers and criminals, of money and poverty pressed together in the narrow streets beneath the same Roman sky. Rome in the 1590s was also a city in the grip of the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church's vast and urgent response to the Protestant challenge, an effort of spiritual renewal and institutional reassertion that touched everything, including art. The Church needed painting. It needed painting that could move the faithful, that could communicate the reality of sacred stories to people who could not read, that could make the abstract doctrines of theology feel immediate and human and true. There was work to be had for a painter who could deliver that. But Caravaggio, in his first years in Rome, was not yet delivering anything to the Church. He was surviving. He worked for a dealer named Monsignor Pandolfo Pucci, whom he later referred to as Monsignor Salad, apparently because Pucci fed him nothing but salad at every meal. He painted in the workshop of a more established painter, churning out the flowers and fruit and small figures that could be sold quickly. He was ill at one point, seriously enough to spend time in a hospital. He was poor, and he was in a city that had not yet decided what to make of him, and all of this shaped what he became. The turn came when Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte noticed him. Del Monte was one of Rome's most cultured and politically connected men, a diplomat, a collector, a man of genuine aesthetic intelligence who moved between the worlds of art and music and science with equal ease. He had been watching the art world of Rome carefully, and what he saw in Caravaggio's early work, the directness of it, the refusal to idealize, the strange and powerful way it used light was something he hadn't seen before. He took Caravaggio in, gave him a room in the Palazzo Madama, introduced him to collectors and patrons, commissioned work from him, and through Del Monte's network, Caravaggio was brought into a circle of sophisticated Roman collectors who were ready for something new, who were in fact hungry for it, even if they did not yet know exactly what form it would take. By the late 1590s, when Judith Beheading Holofernes was almost certainly being painted, Caravaggio's reputation was building with remarkable speed. He had received his first major public commission, paintings for the Contarelli Chapel in the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi, a set of large canvases depicting scenes from the life of St. Matthew. These paintings, when they were installed, caused something close to a sensation. People went to look at them and came back with their friends. Other painters went and stood before them and did not know quite what to say, because the paintings made almost everything else being produced in Rome at the time seem, by comparison, cautious and remote. Caravaggio had found his language, and the city was starting to understand what he was saying. But Caravaggio was also, throughout all of this, a man who generated trouble with a consistency that went beyond bad luck. The legal records of Rome in this period contain his name with a frequency that tells a story on its own. He was charged with assaulting a man with a plate. He was arrested for carrying a sword without a license. He threw artichokes at a waiter. There is a court record, detailed and specific, in which the waiter explains exactly how the artichokes were thrown and in what manner they struck him. He was accused of throwing stones at a police officer. He was involved in a libel case. There are wounds reported in him and in others, and incidents described in legal language that suggests things the documents do not quite say directly. The biographers of his own time and later have argued about what to make of all this. Some have seen it as simply the behavior of a difficult man in a violent city. Rome in this period was not a peaceful place, and men of all classes carried weapons and used them, and what looks extraordinary from a distance may have been less exceptional at the time. Others have seen in Caravaggio's turbulence something connected to his art, the same refusal to accept the smooth and the conventional, the same insistence on the raw reality of things, expressing itself in life as it expressed itself on canvas. Whatever the truth, the consequence was that Caravaggio was a man living always slightly close to the edge of catastrophe. He was famous, and he was dangerous, and he was brilliant, and he was, in some fundamental way, unable to make his life as safe as his talent deserved. And in May of 1606, the catastrophe arrived. The details of what happened that night are still disputed by historians, because the documents are partial and the witnesses had their own interests, and the truth of a street brawl in 17th century Rome is not easily recovered across 4 centuries. What is known is this: on the 28th of May, 1606, in the Campo Marzio neighborhood of Rome, Caravaggio was involved in a violent encounter with a man named Ranuccio Tomassoni. Whether it began as a formal duel over a point of honor, or as a brawl arising from a gambling dispute, or from something more complicated involving money and old grievances, no one has settled this definitively. Ranuccio Tomassoni died. He bled to death from a wound to the femoral artery, a detail that has attracted considerable attention from historians, because a wound to the inner thigh is not where you would typically expect to find the wound of an honorable duel, and some scholars have read into its location a deliberate and targeted act rather than the chaos of a fight. Others have argued it was simply where the sword happened to land. The wound was there. Tomassoni died. Caravaggio fled. A capital sentence was issued against him in absentia. Under the laws of the Papal State, this meant that any citizen of Rome could legally kill him and face no penalty for doing so. He was, in the precise legal language of the time, a man whose life had been formally declared forfeit. He could never safely return to Rome. The years that followed were years of extraordinary productivity and extraordinary suffering, sometimes simultaneously. Naples, where he was beyond the reach of papal jurisdiction and where powerful connections offered him some protection. Malta, where he traveled in 1607 and was received into the Knights of St. John, a military and religious order of considerable prestige, and made a Knight of Justice, a recognition that must have felt like the beginning of a pardon, a path back toward his former life. And then, in Malta, something went wrong again. The records are obscure, but within a year of his knighthood, Caravaggio had been imprisoned, had escaped from what was reportedly an impregnable prison, and had been expelled from the order in absentia, stripped of his knighthood, declared, in the formal language of the expulsion, a foul and rotten member. What he did to provoke this, no one knows with certainty. Whatever it was serious enough to cost him the one safe harbor he had found. Sicily followed. Palermo, Messina, Syracuse. He moved from city to city, painting, always being recognized and sought after, always moving before the pursuit could close in. The paintings from this period have a quality unlike anything from his Roman years. Darker, more compressed, more willing to place figures in spaces that feel genuinely threatening, as though the terror of his own life had finally found its way fully into the work. In 1609, he was back in Naples, and in Naples, someone tried to kill him. He was attacked badly outside a tavern, his face cut, his injuries severe enough that for a time there were reports circulating in Rome that he was dead. He was not dead. But whoever sent the men had made clear that the capital sentence of Rome had a longer reach than any exile could put between Caravaggio and his enemies. In 1610, a pardon seemed finally to be approaching. There were negotiations, intermediaries, powerful families working their connections in Rome on his behalf. Caravaggio gathered some of his paintings and began moving northward toward Rome. He got as far as a small port town called Porto Ercole on the Tuscan coast. And there, in July of 1610, he died. He was 38 years old. The cause is uncertain. Fever, most likely. Perhaps infection from his Naples injuries. Perhaps simple exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who had been running for 4 years and whose body had finally decided it could not run any further. He died at the edge of the sea, in a town he had never intended to stop in, a few weeks short of the pardon that would have let him come home. The timing is so cruel that it almost feels shaped, as though the story requires this ending, this irresolution, this final refusal of comfort. But history is not a story, and cruelty does not require meaning, and Caravaggio died the way he lived, in motion, in trouble, almost, but not quite out of danger. The painting was made, we believe, for a man named Ottavio Costa. Costa was a Genoese banker, wealthy, well-connected, living in Rome during exactly the years when Caravaggio was beginning to be recognized as something extraordinary. He was the kind of collector who moves toward new things before other collectors have decided what to think about them, and his acquisition of Caravaggio's work in this early period suggests a genuine aesthetic intelligence, not merely fashionable taste. What we know about how Costa felt about Judith Beheading Holofernes specifically is remarkable and worth dwelling on. He kept it behind a curtain. There are accounts from inventories, from letters, from the recollections preserved in later documents, that Costa displayed this painting with a curtain drawn across it, revealing it only selectively, only to those he chose to show it to. He asked in his will that the painting never leave the family. He prized it, by most accounts, above everything else he owned. A curtain. Think about what that means. Costa was not hiding the painting. He was not ashamed of it. He was curating the encounter with it. He understood, as anyone who has spent time with his painting understands, that it is not a picture you can walk past. It demands something. It takes something from the person who looks at it. And Costa, who loved it perhaps more than any living person in his time, was protecting both the painting and his guests from the full force of an unmediated encounter. He wanted you to be ready before he pulled the curtain back. Why he commissioned this subject, why a wealthy banker in counter-Reformation Rome wanted a large painting of a woman beheading a man, is not recorded in any document that has survived. But it does not require much imagination. The story of Judith was enormously popular in this period, precisely because it could be read in so many ways simultaneously. As a story of divine deliverance, God working through the most unexpected instrument to save his people. As a moral drama, the triumph of virtue and intelligence over brute force and pride. As a devotional image, a reminder that faith, properly held, makes possible things that seem impossible. And perhaps for certain collectors as something more private, an image of courage, of the capacity to do what must be done, hung in the study where the difficult decisions of a merchant's life were made. Whatever Costa intended, Caravaggio gave him something beyond what he asked for. He always did. Now let us talk about how the painting was made. Caravaggio's working method was, by the standards of his time, unorthodox to the point of being scandalous. The established practice for a major painting involved extensive preparation, drawings, studies of individual figures, compositional sketches worked out on paper before a single brushstroke touched the canvas. The idea was that the painting should be fully thought through in advance, that the canvas was where you executed a plan, rather than where you worked one out. Caravaggio did not work this way. He painted directly from life, from models posed before him, without the mediation of preparatory drawings. His canvases have been examined under infrared reflectography, a technique that allows researchers to see beneath the painted surface, and what they find is not the underdrawing you would expect from a conventionally trained artist, but something much more immediate, incised lines scratched into the ground of the canvas, or paint laid down and then adjusted and adjusted again, the composition emerging through the act of painting rather than preceding it. This meant that his figures have a quality that no amount of careful preparation could have produced. They are not idealized. They are not composites of the best features of multiple models, smoothed and perfected into some elevated type. They are people, specific, individual, physically present people, rendered with the full weight of their actual bodies, their actual expressions, the actual quality of light falling on their actual faces in a specific room at a specific moment. In Judith Beheading Holofernes, you can feel this. The slight asymmetry of Judith's grip, the way the weight of the sword has pulled one hand higher than the other. The specific texture of Holofernes' beard, which has the slightly matted quality of a man who has been drinking and sleeping and is not at his most careful. The web of lines across Abra's cheek, each one specific and placed, not a generalized impression of age, but an individual face in which age has written its particular story. These are not things you get from an idealized drawing. These are things you get from looking, from the long, patient, undeceived practice of looking at what is actually there. The other defining technical feature of the painting is, of course, the light. The technique that later critics would call tenebrism, from the Italian word for darkness, in which figures emerge from an essentially black ground into the full intensity of a concentrated light source. Caravaggio did not invent darkness in painting, but he radicalized it. He made it not a backdrop, but a structural element, as important to the meaning of the painting as any figure within it. The light in this painting is directional and physical. It casts shadows. It creates the sense of a real room with a real lamp somewhere to the left, just outside the frame. And this physical specificity, the sense that the light has a source, that it exists in actual space, is what makes the figures feel so present. They are not lit by painterly convention. They are lit by a lamp. They are in a room. The room is dark and the lamp is close and you are standing in the room with them. Scholars have speculated about the physical conditions of Caravaggio's studio, about whether he worked in a basement or a room with a single high window, about the specific quality of light in Roman buildings of the period. None of this has been definitively established. What is clear is that he was extraordinarily attentive to the behavior of light in actual space, to the way it falls unevenly, to the way it leaves some surfaces in deep shadow while illuminating others with almost painful intensity, to the way it makes certain things impossible to see while making other things impossible to look away from. He turned this attention into a method, and the method into a style, and the style into a revolution. And now the woman holding the sword. Her name almost certainly was Velaide Melandroni. She was born in Siena in 1581, which means she was 17 or 18 when this painting was most likely made, the same age approximately as the figure she models. She had come to Rome, as many people came to Rome in this period, in search of a life that her origin could not provide. What she found, or what found her, was a profession that Rome had always accommodated with a combination of official disapproval and practical tolerance that was one of the city's defining hypocrisies. She was a courtesan, a well-known one with a particular and recognizable face that appears in several of Caravaggio's paintings and in at least one other artist's work from the same period. Philide was not only beautiful. The documents that survive about her, and there are more than you might expect, because people with her visibility generated a certain amount of legal and notarial paperwork, suggest a woman of considerable force of personality. There are records of her being involved in altercations. There is a document recording an incident in which she attacked another woman with such determination that the other woman required medical attention. There are records of her financial arrangements, her lodgings, the men who supported her, and the complicated negotiations of that support. She was not a passive woman. She was not someone who moved quietly through the world, hoping not to attract attention. This matters when you look at the painting, because Caravaggio did not simply borrow Felide's face and place it onto a generic heroic figure. The woman in the painting, Judith, has something of Felide's quality in her. The directness, the willingness to be present for something difficult, the refusal to look away. These are not qualities that belong to idealized biblical heroines. They are qualities that belong to a specific woman who had learned in her particular life that the world does not accommodate those who hesitate. Caravaggio's habit of using recognizable contemporary people as models for biblical figures was one of the things that made his work controversial. When sophisticated Roman viewers looked at Judith, they did not see a timeless heroine of Scripture. They saw a face they knew or knew of, placed in the service of a sacred story. And that displacement, that collision between the sacred and the recognizably present, was unsettling in ways that purely idealized figures are not. An idealized Judith can be admired from a safe distance. She belongs to history, to scripture, to the elevated world of religious art. She does not trouble you by looking like someone who might be walking through the streets of Rome on an ordinary afternoon. Caravaggio's Judith troubles you in exactly this way. She is too present, too specific, too much herself. And there is a further layer, which art historians have circled around for generations without fully resolving. Judith in the story is chaste. Her chastity is not incidental, it is essential to the moral meaning of the narrative. She enters the enemy camp not as a fallen woman, but as a widow of impeccable reputation, and she leaves it with that reputation intact. The story is very careful about this. Holofernes does not get what he wants. He gets something else entirely. And here is his face in this painting, modeled by a woman whose life was organized around the provision of exactly what Holofernes wanted. A woman whose profession was precisely the thing Judith's story refuses. Is this a subversion of the story? Or is it a deepening of it? Does Felide's presence as Judith undermine the biblical narrative, or does it suggest something more interesting? That holiness is not the exclusive property of the conventionally virtuous, that courage and divine purpose can inhabit lives that the respectable world has categorized and dismissed. Caravaggio does not answer this question. He poses it and then he steps back, and the painting has been holding the question open for more than 400 years. This is what great paintings do. They do not resolve. They sustain. The night is deep now. Whatever remained of the day has long since dissolved. The painting is still there in the Palazzo Barberini in the dark of a Roman night, holding everything it has always held: the sword, the light, the three faces, the question that has no answer. We will return to it once more, to its long sleep of obscurity, and to the moment of its recovery, and to the woman who looked at this painting and made something entirely her own in response. But that can wait. Let all of it wait. There is a particular kind of obscurity that is not quite forgetting. It is something softer than that, and stranger. It is the condition of a thing that has not been lost, but has not been seen, truly seen, for a very long time. It sits in a room, or passes through a family, or hangs behind a curtain, and the people around it know it is there, and some of them even admire it, but no one has yet understood what it is. This is what happened to Judith Beheading Holofernes for most of 3 centuries. After Ottavio Costa's death, the painting passed through his family as he had wished. It was inventoried, moved, inherited, catalogued. At various points in its history, it was attributed to other painters, to Caravaggio's follower, Louis Vinson, who had connections to the original and made copies of it, to other artists working in the Caravaggesque tradition. The attribution to Caravaggio himself was not consistently maintained. The painting existed, but its identity was uncertain, and in the world of art history, a painting without a secure identity is a painting that cannot be fully known. The 17th century had understood Caravaggio's importance, or at least had registered his force. The painters who came after him, the Caravaggisti, spread his influence across Italy and Spain and the Netherlands and France, so that by the mid-17th century, something of his method was everywhere in European painting, even if his name was not always attached to it. But the 18th century turned away from him. The Enlightenment and the neoclassical taste that followed it had little patience for darkness, for brutality, for the refusal to idealize. The qualities that made Caravaggio revolutionary in 1600 made him unfashionable in 1750. He was seen as excessive, as vulgar, as a painter who had chosen the wrong things to be realistic about. His reputation contracted. His name became a footnote in histories that gave the century to other painters, other values, other ways of understanding what art was for. The 19th century began a slow rehabilitation, but slowly is the right word. There were scholars who recognized his importance, critics who argued for his place in the canon, exhibitions that brought his work before new audiences. But the full recovery, the restoration of Caravaggio to the absolute center of European art history, where he belongs, was largely the work of the 20th century and of one man in particular. Roberto Longhi. Longhi was one of the great art historians of the 20th century, a scholar of extraordinary range and precision, with a prose style that was itself a form of art, capable of describing a painting in language that made you feel you were standing before it. He had been interested in Caravaggio for decades, writing about him, tracing his influence, arguing for his centrality at a time when many of his colleagues were less certain. And in 1951 he organized a major exhibition in Milan, the Mostra del Caravaggio, that gathered the paintings together in one place and presented them to the public and to the scholarly world with the full weight of his conviction behind them. The exhibition changed things. It is one of those rare curatorial events that genuinely shifts the way a painter is understood, not incrementally, not as one more contribution to an ongoing debate, but decisively in the way that a light being switched on in a dark room is decisive. After 1951, Caravaggio was no longer a footnote or a curiosity or a dangerous talent who had never quite been brought to heel. He was a founder, a revolutionary, one of the painters without whom the history of Western art cannot be told. And in that exhibition, Judith Beheading Holofernes appeared. The story of how it got there is itself a quiet marvel. A restorer named Pico Cellini had seen, years earlier, a painting in the Roman collection of a man named Vincenzo Coppi. He had looked at it carefully in the way that people who spend their professional lives close to paintings learn to look, attending not just to the surface, but to everything beneath it, the quality of the handling, the specific character of the light, the way the paint sat on the canvas. And something in that painting had stayed with him. Not as a fully formed attribution, not as a certainty, but as a memory of quality, the sense of having been in the presence of something extraordinary without yet knowing what to call it. Years passed. Cellini did not forget. This is worth pausing on. The fact that a painting can lodge itself so deeply in a person's memory that it survives years of other paintings, other work, other rooms, other lives, and remains present, insisting quietly on its own importance. Cellini remembered. He traced the painting. He took photographs of it, and he brought those photographs to Longhi. Longhi looked at them and understood immediately. We do not have a record of exactly what he said in that moment, but we know the consequence. The painting was included in the 1951 exhibition attributed to Caravaggio, placed in its proper position in the chronology of his early Roman work. And from that moment it began the journey to becoming one of the most recognized and discussed paintings in the world. It entered the Italian state collections. It went to the Palazzo Barberini, where it hangs today in a room that has been arranged around it with the understanding that this painting requires space. Not the space of a gallery wall, but the space of attention, the space of time, the space you give to something that will not be hurried. There is something that moves me about this story, and I want to stay with it for a moment before we move on. The painting waited. For 300 years, more or less, it waited. It was not destroyed. It was not lost. It passed through hands. It survived. And eventually the right person came along, a restorer with a long memory and an instinct he trusted, and the chain of attention was re-established, and the painting was returned to itself. This is not a story about art history. It is a story about patience and about the strange persistence of quality, the way that something made with genuine care and intelligence will outlast the periods that do not understand it, and will be waiting intact when understanding finally arrives. Caravaggio could not have imagined any of this. He died at 38, running without a pardon, far from home. He could not have known that 400 years later a person would be lying in the dark, listening to someone describe his painting in the quiet hours of the night. He could not have known any of the life his work would have without him. But he made it anyway, with everything he had, and here it still is. Before we rest, there is one more painting, one more woman, one more sword, one more dark room. Made by a different hand in a different city a few years after Caravaggio's, and in some ways even more powerful, or powerful in a different register, a register that Caravaggio did not or could not access. Her name was Artemisia Gentileschi. She was born in Rome in 1593, the daughter of Orazio Gentileschi, himself a painter working in the Caravaggesque tradition. She grew up surrounded by painting, by the language of paint and light and composition, and she absorbed it with a facility that her father recognized early, and her father's colleagues recognized more slowly because she was a woman, and the recognition of women's talent has rarely moved quickly in any century. When Artemisia was 17, she was assaulted by a painter named Agostino Tassi, who had been hired to teach her perspective. What followed was a trial, one of the most documented and disturbing legal proceedings in the history of Renaissance art, in which Artemisia was subjected to interrogation under torture in the form of thumbscrews while she gave her testimony. The purpose of the torture in the legal procedure of the time was to verify the truth of her account. She maintained her account throughout. Tassi was convicted, though his sentence was light and largely unenforced. Artemisia went on to become one of the most important painters of the 17th century. She worked in Florence, in Venice, in Naples, in London. She was the first woman admitted to the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno in Florence. She painted for the Medici, for Charles I of England, for some of the most powerful patrons in Europe. And she returned, more than once, to the story of Judith. Her most famous version, Judith slaying Holofernes, painted in the early 1610s and now in the Uffizi in Florence, is one of the paintings that is always shown alongside Caravaggio's when the subject is discussed. Not because it imitates his, but because it answers it. Because it takes the same story, the same darkness, the same compressed violence, and makes something entirely and unmistakably its own. The debt to Caravaggio is visible, and Artemisia would not have denied it. The dark background, the concentrated light from the left, the close compression of figures against the picture plane, the insistence on the physical reality of what is happening, these are Caravaggesque elements, absorbed and transformed. She learned from him, as almost every painter of her generation did. But what she made with those lessons is not what he made. In Artemisia's painting, Judith and Abra work together. Both women lean into the act, bodies straining, arms pressing down with coordinated force. Judith's face is set, not conflicted, not divided, not pulled between intention and revulsion. She is fully present, fully committed, every part of her aligned with what she is doing. There is no lean away. There is no split between the arms that act and the body that recoils. She is entirely here, entirely in this moment, and she intends to finish. Abra, in Artemisia's version, is not standing slightly to the side with a bag and a watchful expression. She is actively helping, pressing down on Holofernes with real physical force, her weight thrown into the effort alongside Judith's. Two women working together, determined to complete a task they have undertaken together. The solidarity between them is physical, enacted, unmistakable. Scholars and critics have been writing about the difference between these two paintings for decades, and the conversation has not exhausted itself, because the difference keeps opening onto larger questions. Caravaggio's Judith hesitates, or rather, her body hesitates while her will persists. Artemisia's does not. Is this a difference in the painter's understanding of courage, of violence, of what it means to be a woman doing a thing the world does not expect of women? Is it a difference rooted in experience, in the specific experience of a woman who had been before a court, who had given testimony under torture, who knew from the inside what it costs to hold your account of the truth against the pressure of people who wanted you to change it. There is no provable answer to this. Art history is careful about drawing direct lines between an artist's biography and their work, because the line is never as straight as it seems. Artemisia painted many things, not only acts of female violence. Caravaggio painted many things that were not about violence at all. The relationship between what a painter has lived and what a painter makes is real but oblique. It does not translate directly. It refracts, it transforms, it finds its way into the work through paths that even the painter might not have been able to fully describe. But it is hard, looking at Artemisia's Judith, at the absolute commitment in her face, at the way her whole body is involved in the act, at the complete absence of division between what she has decided and what she is doing. It is hard not to feel that this is a painting made by someone who understands from the inside what it is to hold your ground. The two paintings are not competitors. They are not making the same argument or reaching for the same truth. They are two different ways of seeing the same story, two different accounts of what courage looks like, what violence costs, what women are capable of when the world requires everything of them. Caravaggio's Judith asks, what does it do to a person to do a necessary and terrible thing? Artemisia's asks, what does it look like when a person has already answered that question and chosen to do it anyway, completely without reservation? Both questions are real. Both paintings are true. And the fact that they exist together in the world, in conversation across 4 centuries, is one of the reasons that art history is not merely the study of objects, but the study of what human beings have needed to say to each other, and how they have found ways to say it that outlast them. We have been with this painting for a long time now. Long enough to have walked slowly around it, into the story behind it, and the life behind that, and the century behind that, and back again to the canvas itself. The dark background, the concentrated light, the 3 figures pressed close together in the moment that Caravaggio chose above all other moments to paint. The during. Not the before, not the after. The unstable, irreversible, costly during. There is a reason this painting has never stopped being looked at, never stopped generating writing and argument and response, and now conversation in the dark between people who will never meet. It is not simply because it is technically brilliant, though it is. It is not simply because Caravaggio was a genius, though he was. It is because the painting is about something that does not age. It is about the cost of doing the right thing, about the fact that justice and violence are not always separable, about what it means to act when action is required, and to remain human in the acting, and to carry the memory of it afterward, without pretending it was easy or clean or without consequence. Judith's face does not give you permission to feel uncomplicated about what she is doing. It does not tell you that righteousness is painless, or that courage is comfortable, or that the right side of history is a comfortable place to stand. It tells you that she is doing this, and it is right, and it costs her something, and she is doing it anyway. All of these things at once, none of them canceling any other out. This is, in the end, what Caravaggio understood better than almost any painter of his time, or perhaps any time, that the truth of a human moment is not simple. That the face of a person doing a necessary and terrible thing does not look one way. It looks like that, like Judith's face, furrowed and focused and pulling fractionally away even as the hands continue. Like something that has no clean name, that you recognize not from other paintings, but from life, from the faces of people you have known who were asked to do hard things and did them. He painted that face. He painted it in a rented room in Rome, probably by lamplight, more than 400 years ago. And it is still here, still legible, still true. The sword is still now. Judith has done what she came to do. And now, in the story, as in every version of it ever painted or written or told, she and Abra turn and walk back out through the camp and up the mountain road in the dark and through the gate of Bethulia before dawn. And the night closes behind them as though nothing happened. The sentries saw 2 women go out to pray and 2 women return. The dark absorbed everything else. By the time the sun rises over the Assyrian camp, Judith is home. She has changed her clothes. She is a widow again, composed, private, back inside the life the world can see. What the night held, the night keeps. In the Palazzo Barberini, the painting hangs in its room in the dark. Ottavio Costa's curtain was drawn back across it long ago by hands that are dust now in a house that no longer stands. But the painting remains as he knew it, self-contained, waiting, requiring nothing from anyone, until the moment someone chooses to look. Tonight the curtain was drawn back and the painting was seen. And now it closes again, and the dark is just the dark, and you are left with whatever it gave you, which is yours now, to keep or to let dissolve into sleep, whichever comes first. Sleep now. The night will hold everything until morning. It always does. Good night.